Hello and welcome to another episode of our Experts of the Americas series. I'm Valentina Sader, Deputy Director for Impactful Programming and Brazil Lead at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council, where I lead our work on gender in Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, I'm delighted to speak to Paula Tavares, a senior legal and gender specialist at the World Bank, where she focuses on promoting gender-informed policymaking, improving the legal framework, protecting women from discrimination and gender-based violence, and enhancing women's economic opportunities. Paula, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you, Valentina. It's a pleasure and honor to be here and be part of this important series on the Expert of the Americas.
Thank you. And today's episode is a partnership with UN Women Multi-Country Office Caribbean and part of the work that we are doing with them on the Caribbean region, particularly Guyana and Jamaica. According to World Bank data, violence against women and girls is a global pandemic that affects 1 in 3 women in their lifetime. Although not an exclusive issue to the Caribbean, gender-based violence is common in the region. Statistics suggest that around 40% of women in the Caribbean experience violence at the hand of their partners, and that's only what has been reported. The prevalence of this phenomenon shows that despite remarkable efforts by governments and civil society organizations in the Caribbean, this issue is a difficult one to overcome, which is why we're more than happy to have Paula join us today and help us unpack some of these issues. Paula, first and foremost, to address gender-based violence, we must try to understand it. What factors could begin to explain this data and the extent to which gender-based violence is present in the Caribbean?
Thank you, Valentina. A bit of the context, and I think you've already given us some of the very challenging figures. We know that women in Latin America and the Caribbean and the entire region face very high rates of gender-based violence. We know that the region holds the highest rates of femicide in the world. In 2018, for example, about 9 women killed every day. This is recent data. And the region has the second highest rate of non-partner sexual violence in the world. In the Caribbean as well, violence is endemic. As you correctly mentioned, nearly half of women surveyed in these countries have faced at least one form of violence. And here we talk about physical, sexual, economic, or emotional violence, the 4 main types of violence. We know that 3 of the top 10 recorded rape rates in the world occur in the Caribbean, and that the most prevalent form of intimate partner violence is emotional violence in the region. 34% of ever partnered women have experienced this type of violence in their lifetime. This includes threats, being humiliated, intimidated by male partners. Physical violence is also a huge challenge, with at least 1 out of 4 having experienced physical violence. In specific countries, similar data exists in Jamaica as well. More than 1 in 4 women experiencing physical and or sexual violence. In Guyana, for example, more than half of all women have experienced at least 1 form of violence. The causes are very similar around the world. Root causes of gender-based violence from global research points to unequal power relations, patriarchal social and traditional gender norms based on systems and assumptions about gender roles that support gender-based violence. So we have gender roles within the home, within society, women's predominantly responsibility for certain tasks, the views on women's responsibilities, women's limited autonomy, oftentimes, and presence outside the home historically, the prevalence of controlling behaviors, particularly in intimate relationships. So beliefs about fidelity, beliefs about male entitlement to women's bodies and control over women, including the acceptance in many cases of punishment, including corporal punishment, as a means to discipline or to control women. So surveys around the belief of harmful practices such as these are actually high in the region, which is one of the key factors that is a challenge toward addressing the issue.
These are, these preconceptions around gender norms are very often ingrained in society and its culture. And again, as you mentioned, not necessarily exclusive to the Caribbean, but changing social behavior is a long but possible process. What role does education, awareness raising campaigns, and the media play in rooting out violence? And I think that this is key because, as you mentioned, this is something that is so ingrained in society and it goes hand in hand with some of the perceptions that both women and men have with regards to their norms and gender norms and roles. There's such an important effort here that must be taken in terms of education, in terms of awareness raising, the media as well playing an important role in how to frame the narrative around gender-based violence.
Exactly. So when we think about the root causes and the key elements that allow gender-based violence to continue thriving across generations and the systemic element of it, a lot of the issues have to do with some of these very ingrained social and gender norms, right? So in that sense, key factors, if thinking about longer term and actually ending gender-based violence, are connected to education, awareness raising, and the media here has a large role in all of this as well, right? And that's what we call kind of the longer term and even the prevention aspect of it, because really what we need to change is the mindset behind this, is the beliefs that society has, that individuals have, right? They grow up in a society that still is conducive to reproducing, to having these behaviors, and these are perpetuated. So unless you have education, and this starts in schools, it starts in the home, it's education both in the private sphere, right? So within families, and we know that, for example, parenting programs, interventions from the World Bank show the effectiveness of parenting programs that help change gender norms, and education within the home are effective. Also school-based programs, so ensuring that education, even at the formal level, can help change these social norms. In terms of publicly and public awareness and the understanding of this as society, awareness raising campaigns are critical. And we've known the effectiveness of campaigns that help change these norms, that reshape the values of society and shift these norms. So these are all very important. And of course, the media has a key role in this as a dissemination means and tool for all of these areas.
One of the biggest challenges to addressing gender-based violence, Paula, that we have heard and in consultations with many of our partners on the ground, and then also through research that has been done all over, the world, is the lack of legal frameworks or the inefficiency of the legal system to actually identify and then prosecute cases of gender-based violence. The World Bank, even the data from the World Bank says that even in countries where laws on domestic violence do exist, 1 in 4 of them do not actually protect women from physical and sexual violence. Given your expertise, what have been some of the policy and legal difficulties and challenges to help curb cases of gender-based violence, and what has been done to mitigate some of these risks?
Thank you. So yes, I mean, specifically looking at laws on domestic violence, and this is data that the World Bank has been tracking for many years, we still have about 15% of countries worldwide that don't even have legislation. So that is already a huge gap. Even in countries that do have these laws, as you mentioned, they don't necessarily cover all forms of violence, or they might cover the different forms of violence, but they're not effective in ensuring implementations, right? So regulations and the structures that are needed to make sure that the legislation can be effective. So that is a key issue, right? When we look at, for example, other laws that also connect to these prevailing gender norms and the discrimination, the unequal power relations, we still know that women have unequal rights in many countries. Apart from domestic violence laws, the importance of ensuring that laws that affect women's rights within the family, within marriage, for example, that can ensure that they have equal status in society within the home and outside the home are very important. And there's still many countries that have not changed all of these laws. We have many laws, for example, even in Latin America and the Caribbean, that have protections against gender-based violence, but may still allow for child marriage. And we know that early marriage is often a precursor to domestic violence and tends to perpetuate the cycle of violence. So all of these areas, so in terms of legislation, it's the adoption of specific laws, ensuring that laws are comprehensive and can be implemented through specific regulations, but also ensuring that the broader legal system ensures the rights of women and that there are policies that can make these effective and ensure that these changes. So these are some of the difficulties that we still see in many countries.
In a way, you're also correlating, right, the beginning of our conversation in terms of how these are gender perceptions and norms that have been ingrained into society, and in a way legislation is also the reflect the society in which the norms were created. How do you begin to address an issue like this then? And are there any, and what have been some successful examples of laws that might have effectively defined gender-based violence and appropriately followed through with its prosecution, for example?
So one is, as I mentioned, I think the key first step is ensuring that legislation ensures equal rights, so eliminates discrimination, can help strengthen and harmonize laws on family to laws on violence, the protection against violence, ensuring that where legislation exists, adequate implementation is also enforced. So this includes having funding mechanisms, which are often included in legislation. So ensuring that there are budgetary allocations, ensuring that there are specialized services, right? So ensuring that this is also determined in legislation, including training of the different professionals that deal with cases of violence, ensuring that the women who need to access services can be protected, have adequate services to look for. So this includes training, this includes mechanisms, this includes coordination among the different actors, and this is all part of legislation, right? Ensuring that legislation, and these are the best policies, are comprehensive and can ensure comprehensive mechanisms for the coordination, for multidisciplinary action, right? And ensuring also the implementation at a geographical level. So we know in many countries, for example, you do have legislation, you might have good services in capital cities or in larger cities, but not necessarily in remote locations. So that is an issue. Some good examples do exist when we think about, examples of countries that have been considered to have model legislation. Brazil is one that comes to mind. The Maria da Penha law is one that is still a reference law, considered one of the 3 most comprehensive, and it has all of these aspects that I've mentioned, right? So it does address different types of violence, all the different types of violence. It addresses prevention mechanisms. It includes mechanisms for education, for awareness raising, for coordination among the different actors. It really is a very comprehensive and substantive law. There is no legislation that is perfect, however, and we know even the Maria da Penha law, one thing that we often mention and is now being discussed is the fact that it doesn't necessarily address gender-based violence in its broader form. So it's still addressing domestic violence, violence within the family. So that is part of what the country is looking at discussing right now. There are other countries that have adopted laws that address gender-based violence, but are not necessarily as comprehensive, including all the different elements. So what we know is that every country can still improve legislation. I think we've seen through the data that we collect on legislation and working with different countries that progress has been happening in many countries. We know in the Caribbean specifically, we have seen progress in improving legislation. For example, in Guyana, we know that recently investments were made to create a specialized family court, a sexual offenses court, a children's court. These are all very important mechanisms to ensure that, for example, access to justice can be more effective. So we continue to see progress, and we often say that this is how we see, the improvements happening, is looking at the examples and the model work, but also continuously improving on the different countries.
And Paula, we've been talking a bit more about the government in particular, but addressing gender-based violence is a whole of society effort that includes the private sector, civil society organizations, the media, and of course, multilateral institutions like the World Bank. Beyond the legal framework that must be in place, how can other actors, particularly NGOs and the private sector, be greater drivers of change?
So we know that they both, NGOs and the private sector are important drivers of change. One of the effective types of interventions that we've seen with the World Bank have definitely to do with community activism, with the role of civil society in driving change. We know that civil society has been critical in driving even legislative change in many countries. We've done some studies around that and the importance of grassroots organizations, but also civil movements, women's movements in driving the adoption of legislation. So critical work at that level. The private sector, similarly, in many countries, the private sector comes in with state of the art and bringing in examples and kind of interventions from other countries, especially thinking about how the workplace sometimes, or the role of institutions and organizations, can lead the way in supporting women, supporting driving change at the community level, at the society level. So all of these are very important. And we've seen also that, of course, in terms of things that are critical to improving the situation, these include often a combination of economic empowerment programs for women. So there you also have the role of each of the different sectors, the private sector many times, combined with kind of community-based approaches, awareness raising in the private sector. NGOs have a critical role in this. Again, school-based and organization-based interventions. So all the awareness raising, the education that is done within these different types of organizations, all of these are critical.
This is definitely no easy task, but it's an effort that we should all be a part of. Then finally, Paula, I wanted to ask you if you had one piece of advice on how to begin legal efforts to prevent and curb cases of gender-based violence in the region. What would that advice be?
Hard to have a silver bullet for this. There are many elements. So I think, as I mentioned, one thing is really to eliminate any discriminatory laws. I think that is a first step. Ensure that specific laws exist, so the adoption of laws that are effective. But then that has to be combined with, again, funding mechanisms, ensuring that implementation can occur, and that can be within legislation, and a greater focus on prevention. As I mentioned, this has been the approach of the World Bank, understanding that we won't really make long-term impact if we don't change the norms that exist today, and that has to do with prevention. And so a lot of the focus on prevention is critical so that we can really shift the needle in addressing the issue.
Paula, with that, we have a lot of work to do. So let's get that going. Thank you so much for joining us once again, because this is not the first time that you're here for an Experts of the Americas episode. So thank you for joining us this time. And I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me.